the whole oligarchy, remember, when we say oligarchy, the form of rule that we have is the Venetian system, and I've written about this. You can now find, if you look hard enough on the internet, a book about Paolo Sarpi of Venice, his networks, and the coming of the 30 Years' War. It's a study of the Venetian oligarchy and its foreign policy and its public diplomacy, let's say, around 1600 to 1620 or 1625. The Venetian system is largely the one that was exported by the Venetians to England in the 1500s into the 1600s. Essentially, the Sarpi period is the point where that culminates. That's the Whig Party, right? As Benjamin Disraeli wrote in his novel Coningsby, the Whig Party is the Venetian party, and the Whig Party is the party of the top level of the English nobility, of noblemen so powerful they could challenge the king. This is a polycentric system, meaning that there is no one dictator most of the time. There are factions, there are various leaders, there are more or less influential. So it's always a mistake to say, I'm here in New Haven, Connecticut, and this is Skull and Bones, and they run the world from in here. No, they don't. And nor is it correct to say that the Bilderberger here at this shabby hotel is where they run the world, right? Because that's not, it's wrong, because there's Russia, there's China, there are lots of other power centers, and even within the Anglo-American world, right? If the Koch brothers haven't shown up at Bilderberg directly, maybe that means that they prefer to operate in other ways, right, in their own way. Maybe they don't want to give their money to Bilderberg, because that's what you have to do if you want to attend these meetings. But we can always say Henry Kissinger deserves a place of honor, of infamy, because of his role with his National Security Memorandum, right, 200 I think it was, from the time that he was at the National Security Council and the Secretary of State's post. That was, I think, a critical turning point. It came right after the end of the Bretton Woods system, August 15th, 1971. Nixon, Kissinger, others combined to put an end to the best world monetary system the world has ever seen, before or since. The Bretton Woods system, with its fixed parities and its gold settlement system, was not perfect, but better than anything before or since. The most successful monetary system in human history. When that was taken away, the rhythm of worldwide economic development began to slow, real wages began to decline, especially in the United States. Then you have the Stockholm Conference for Environmental Lunatics in 1972, the Bucharest Population Conference, the Rome Food Conference, series of UN conferences that essentially begin to shape the world in this Malthusian, zero-growth, anti-technology direction with the built-in premise then of overpopulation. So things begin to change. I would point to the Carter administration as a tremendous turning point. Secretary of State Ed Muskie plays a very, very important role. In those days it was known as Global 2000 and Global Futures, and these were to essentially make depopulation the main content of U.S. Foreign policy. And from then on, under Reagan, it's not quite so prominent, but by the time we get into the 90s, I think it's become overwhelming. So Kissinger, Muskie, who else do we want to talk about?
Let's see. Let me ask you a couple of random.
Oh yeah, let's also, we can talk about the private side. It's very interesting to see something like the Club of Rome, right? The Club of Rome with the Limits to Growth report, 1968 to 1972, thereabouts. It required the collapse of the social movements of the 1960s to create a climate of sufficient pessimism and degradation in the U.S. population especially, that they would accept the idea Malthusianism. Right? Malthusianism is pessimism. Really, it goes against the grain of U.S. Traditions. U.S. tradition is more pretty much that you can fix problems with technology and science. That progress is the remedy for these things, and it actually did cut across any left-right divide, which anyway was not at that moment was not so central as it seems to be now. So you have where were we now?
Club of Rome.
Yeah, the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome had to wait to bring out what they actually thought. You could see people in the Club of Rome. I went back once and reconstructed what some of them had been saying in the 50s, and they weren't able to say technology is bad and it's time to go back to the Dark Ages, right? Which they did do by the end of the 60s. But they would say, well, we don't know whether this reactor should be built here. Maybe atomic energy is not the right way to go. Maybe this, maybe that. So therefore, they could only do what the market would bear. But by 1968, they saw that the activities of Bernardine Dohrn and Bill Ayers had pretty much destroyed the student movement and the anti-war movement, the Weathermen, the terrorist faction. With those people, it's interesting that Obama grows precisely out of that group. That group had pretty much wrecked student and anti-war politics. You'd had the assassinations, the Kennedys, King, and so forth. So the pessimism had built up. Pessimism and irrationalism had reached the point where the Club of Rome could come out of the shadows. Interesting thing is, who's in the Club of Rome? Aurelio Peccei. Who were these people? A lot of them were old fascists. There's a very interesting connection. People who had been Nazis and fascists became radical ecologists and Malthusians and supporters of the population bomb or denouncers of the population bomb at the end of the 1960s. So Aurelio Peccei was certainly one of those. That's his background. And then there's Alexander King of the Club of Rome, and the publication I used to work for once did an interview with Alexander King. And King at a certain point said, off the record, and I tell you what this is really all about, is we don't want those bloody wogs in Africa multiplying so much, right? This is the strategy for demographic control of Africa and these other third empire places. So in other words, it was based on racism, and that was the content. Now, then you wonder, why doesn't all of Africa, say, rebel against this? The problem is that oligarchy stuff that we mentioned. It is that inside these countries, there are people in the elite, in whatever it is, Nigeria, South Africa, all sorts of places, who would share that idea, basically accepting themselves. They'd say, yes, it's true. The people that I have to struggle with every day really are bestial. But of course, I, as a rich oligarch, I can go with the people from the Sorbonne or Oxford or whatever it is. So, Aurelio Peccei, Alexander King. Now, just in terms of this idea of how the Nazis become green, because that's what it is. They go from brown to green. One of the best examples is the philosopher Martin Heidegger. This is the founder of modern existentialism. Sartre of France is nothing but Heidegger sort of rehashed. And Heidegger, of course, had given, when he became the rector of the University of Freiburg in the 1930s, he had given this speech in favor of Hitler, which, well, leaves nothing unsaid in terms of his devotion to the Führer. By the time we get into the 1950s, what's Heidegger doing? He's been given his denazification stamp, and he's out there preaching ecology. Another very good example, Charles Lindbergh, the archetypical American Nazi, the leader of the America First movement, right? Friend of Goering, he received medals from the Nazis, which he was glad to accept, but he sent back his commission in the U.S. Army Reserve because he hated Roosevelt so much. He hated Roosevelt so much that he preferred Hitler, but he was also completely on the line of racism, race theory, the Anglo-Saxon master race, the Germanic or Nordic master race, you name it. Lindbergh has all of it, right? This is the air hero from the 1920s. At that time, it was an important thing because he was probably the most famous person in the United States and maybe in the world for many of those years. So Lindbergh, he goes from being Hitler's main apologist in the United States to becoming a complete radical environmentalist, but head over heels, more than Heidegger, because he had slightly longer to do it, right? So he's basically in Africa preaching that technology is bad and concerned about the forests and the oceans and the beginnings of global warming and all the rest of it. So there's a very interesting connection between fascism and environmentalism, and there's a very significant cohort of people who make this transition in their own lives.